In the vast, silent cathedral of the north, the world is reduced to a whisper of wind and an endless expanse of white. Here, in the deep skeletal forest, the cold is a living entity, a patient predator that seeps into the bones and stills the heart. But in this kingdom of ice, a far more ravenous beast awakens. It is not a creature that stalks the frozen pines, but a fire that burns from within. It is the hollow, agonizing ache of hunger, a force that can melt the soul faster than any frost and drive a human being to forsake everything they once were. The Algonquian-speaking peoples, who have weathered these winters for millennia, had a name for this terrible transformation. They called it Wendigo. To them, this was no simple campfire tale for frightening children. It was a terrifyingly real possibility, a spiritual sickness, born of isolation and the gnawing emptiness of starvation. The Wendigo is the name for the moment. A human being, pushed to the absolute limit of endurance, makes a choice to satisfy their own life-ending hunger by committing the most unforgivable sin, consuming the flesh of their own kind. The creature that results is a gaunt, cannibalistic giant, a terrifying embodiment of the unforgiving cold and the ultimate human taboo. It is a monster whose insatiable hunger is a curse, ensuring that one horrific act of survival becomes an eternity of damnation. The legend of the Wendigo was born in a specific place, a vast and formidable wilderness that shaped the story in its own image. This is the boreal forest, the great circumpolar taiga that stretches across the northern latitudes of North America. It is a world of endless trees, spruce, pine, and fir standing in silent, somber ranks, their ranks broken only by the ghostly white of birch. It is a land of 10,000 lakes, bodies of water so numerous and remote they remain unnamed, their surfaces mirroring a sky that can feel impossibly vast and lonely. In the brief, explosive summer, this world is a riot of life, the air thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth, the drone of insects a constant hum. But summer is a fleeting, desperate guest. Winter is the true king of this domain. When the cold descends, it is not a gentle transition, it is a conquest. The vibrant greens and blues of the forest are bleached into a stark, unforgiving palette of white, grey, and black. The rivers and lakes are silenced, locked under thick plates of ice. The land itself seems to hold its breath, entering a state of suspended animation under a crushing blanket of snow. This is a world where survival is an art form, a complex dance between human ingenuity and the brutal whims of nature. For millennia, this has been the home of the Algonquian-speaking peoples. The Cree, the Ojibwe, the Innu, the Anishinaabe. They did not see the forest as a thing to be conquered, but as a living entity to be understood and respected, a great and powerful being that both gave life and, in the starving times, could take it away. Their entire existence was woven from the threads of this relationship. They knew the patterns of the caribou, the secret places where the fish would winter, the barks and roots that could serve as medicine. But more than anything, they knew that the individual was a fiction in the face of the northern winter. Survival was only possible through the strength of the community. This understanding was not a casual philosophy. It was the most fundamental law of their world. The successful hunter's prize was not his alone, but belonged to the entire band. The last reserves of food were for the children and the elders. To hoard, to hide one's sustenance while another went hungry, was more than a crime. It was a blasphemy. It was an act that tore at the sacred bonds that held the world together, an invitation for a spiritual darkness to seep in. It is from the terror of this sacred law being broken that the Wendigo first emerges, a whisper on the freezing wind. It is the manifestation of what happens when the siege of winter finally breaks the spirit, when the gnawing, internal agony of starvation overthrows the communal soul. The Wendigo is not a beast that wanders in from some other realm. It is a human being, unmade. It is a neighbor, a cousin, a family member who, in a moment of ultimate despair, surrenders to the hunger and commits the ultimate taboo. By consuming the flesh of another human, they do not simply save their own life, they forfeit their own soul. This single act is a point of no return. It awakens a new and monstrous appetite within them, an insatiable spiritual void that can never be filled. The temporary salvation of a single meal becomes a curse of eternal, ravenous hunger. From that moment on, they are no longer a person. They have become the thing the elders warned of in hushed, fearful tones. They have become a Wendigo. Across the vast northern sweep of a continent, this shared nightmare was given many names. The Cree, whose lands stretched into the unforgiving subarctic plains, called it Wendigo. The Ojibwe of the Great Lakes woodlands knew it as Wendigo. To the east, among the Mi'kmaq and Wabanaki, a similar ice-hearted cannibal giant was called the Chenu. The Innu simply called it Atchen. The names shifted with the dialect, the tongue of the storyteller shaping the sound, but the terror they described was the same. Each name was a key to the same dark room, a different word for the horrifying truth that the most dangerous monster was not a beast of the woods, but the human being who had surrendered their soul to the killing cold of winter. The Wendigo, in its purest form, is not the creature itself, but the malevolent force that creates it. It is an evil spirit, an ancient and powerful Manito that is the personification of the starving winter. It is the very essence of the killing cold, of famine, and of the gnawing, desperate hunger that can drive a sane person to madness. This spirit is a patient hunter. It does not attack the strong or the content. It preys on the spiritually weak. It is drawn to a person whose heart has begun to grow cold with selfishness, envy, or greed. The man who hoards his food, the woman who harbors a bitter grudge, the hunter who refuses to share his kill. These are the ones who make themselves vulnerable. By turning their back on their community, they open a door in their soul, and the spirit of the Wendigo waits for just such an invitation. The possession is a slow, insidious freezing of the soul. The spirit enters the vulnerable person, and a terrible transformation begins from within. The warmth of human feeling, compassion, love, loyalty, is the first thing to be extinguished. It is replaced by a single, cold, and all-consuming obsession, an insatiable hunger. This is not the normal hunger for food that sustains life. It is a perverse, spiritual craving for human flesh, a need that is a symptom of the spirit's complete dominion. The person's soul is pushed out, their consciousness erased, and what is left is a human shell animated by this ancient, ravenous force. The final, horrifying act of cannibalism is not what creates the Wendigo. It is merely the irreversible confirmation of its victory. It is the moment the last embers of the human spirit die and the monster is fully born. The creature that now stands in the snow is a grotesque mockery of the human form it once inhabited. The first thing to overwhelm the senses is its sheer, unnatural scale. The Wendigo is a giant, a towering effigy of despair that looms over the tallest of men, often said to stand as high as the winter-stripped pines themselves. But this is not the robust, powerful giant of heroic myth. It is a figure of impossible, horrifying emaciation. Its power is not born of muscle and bulk, but of a ravenous, supernatural emptiness. The body is a study in starvation. Its desiccated skin, the color of ash or the sickly yellow-gray of old frostbite, is pulled drum-tight across a skeletal frame. There is no fat, no flesh, only a thin, translucent parchment that barely conceals the horrifying architecture of its bones. The ribs are a cage of sharp, protruding edges, a gaunt latticework over a hollow chest. Its limbs are elongated and stick-like, ending in gnarled hands with long, talon-like fingers, stained with the evidence of its unholy meals. The Wendigo is a walking contradiction, a being of immense size and terrifying strength, yet it is forever the very picture of a person who is starved to death. It is a walking corpse, animated not by life, but by an unquenchable, agonizing hunger. If one dares to look upon its face, they will find the map of its damnation. The eyes are sunk deep within their sockets, burning with a cold, predatory light. They are not the eyes of a beast, which hunt out of instinct, nor the eyes of a man, which can hold pity or reason. They are like two frozen pools of moonlight, glowing with a malevolent intelligence and an utterly vacant, bottomless need. Its mouth is a ragged, lipless gash. In its unending craving, the creature is said to have chewed away its own flesh, leaving a permanent, horrifying snarl that exposes jagged, yellowed fangs and gums blackened with rot. From this ruin, a long, slender tongue may loll out, tasting the frigid air, forever seeking the scent of its only sustenance, human flesh. At the spiritual and physical core of the monster is its heart. The elders are unanimous on this point. A Wendigo's heart is made of solid ice. It is the physical incarnation of its frozen soul, the source of its relentless cruelty. This is why the Wendigo is so difficult to kill. Wounds to its body mean little. To destroy the creature, one must destroy its frozen heart, either by shattering it with a silver bullet or a special weapon, or by holding the entire creature in a great fire until the ice at its core is finally melted, releasing the tormented human spirit from its prison. The curse of the Wendigo contains a final, terrible paradox. Many traditions speak of a horrifying reality. The creature grows in proportion to the meals it consumes. The more human flesh it eats, the larger, yet somehow gaunter, it becomes. Its insatiable hunger is therefore matched by an ever-expanding body, ensuring that it can never be full, never be satisfied. This is the ultimate, cosmic expression of greed. The momentary relief of a gruesome meal only serves to make the subsequent hunger more profound, more agonizing, and more vast. It is a hunger that quite literally grows with every bite, a self-perpetuating torment with no hope of conclusion. Against a spiritual sickness as profound as the Wendigo, a spear or a bow was useless. This was not a physical war to be fought with muscle and sinew, but a metaphysical one, waged on the treacherous, snow-swept terrain of the human soul. The guardians who stood against this threat were not the community's strongest hunters, but its spiritual authorities, the medicine people, the healers, the mystics, the shaman. These were the men and women who could walk between worlds, the dream walkers and listeners to the language of the wind. They understood that the health of the community was a delicate balance of body and spirit, and they knew the sacred rituals required to restore that balance when it was broken. The Wendigo was the ultimate imbalance, a shattering of the cosmic order, and the shaman was the community's first and last line of defense. Their work began long before the first snowflake fell, woven into the very fabric of daily life. The most effective protection against the Wendigo was a healthy, cohesive community, and the shaman's role was to be a constant teacher. Through fireside stories and seasonal ceremonies, they tirelessly reinforced the sacred laws of sharing, generosity, and mutual support. They taught the children that to hoard food was to starve the soul, and reminded the adults that to isolate oneself was to become vulnerable to the cold spirits that lurked in the darkness beyond the firelight. They were the spiritual weavers of the community, constantly mending the social fabric to ensure there were no frayed threads, no holes through which the Wendigo spirit could enter. But in the brutal reality of the starving winter, prevention was not always enough. A shaman had to be a vigilant diagnostician, a reader of souls, ever watchful for the subtle, terrifying symptoms of a spirit beginning to freeze. The sickness would often first manifest in the ephemeral world of sleep. A person, their face etched with a new and secret terror, would confess to the shaman that they were haunted by nightmares of cannibalism, of the repulsive yet tempting taste of human flesh. In the waking world, they might become withdrawn and sullen, refusing to take part in communal meals, their eyes taking on a strange, distant glaze. Their family would notice them staring a little too long, a little too intently, at the others in the lodge. This was not treated as a crime, but as a desperate, terrifying cry for help. It was the sign that a human spirit was losing its battle with the monster within, and a dangerous healing was required. The first intervention was one of fierce, determined compassion. The afflicted person was not an outcast, but a patient in the grip of a spiritual fever. They were brought to a sweat lodge, a sacred, womb-like space for purification. As steam filled the small enclosure, the shaman would chant and pray, calling on benevolent spirits to help drive the cold intruder out. The patient would be given protective talismans to wear, small bundles of sweetgrass, cedar, and other sacred medicines, their fragrant smoke designed to ward off evil influences. But the most crucial part of the healing was a ritual that fought the internal cold with external warmth and care. The shaman would prepare a special broth of warm, fatty meat or grease, often from a bear, an animal considered to possess great spiritual power and a sacred connection to the healing arts. The patient was gently, sometimes forcefully, fed this rich, life-affirming substance. The act was both literal and deeply symbolic. It was a physical attempt to satisfy the body's desperate craving for fat and sustenance. Spiritually, it was an infusion of warmth from the entire community, a reminder of their care, a powerful act of nourishment intended to melt the ice that was beginning to form around the patient's heart. For many, this compassionate intervention was enough. The fever of the soul would break, the nightmares would cease, and the person would be brought back from the brink weeping with relief. But sometimes the sickness was too deep. The spirit of the Wendigo was too strong. When the healing failed, when the person's humanity was fully consumed and they committed an act of violence or cannibalism, the shaman's role underwent a terrible and tragic transformation. They were no longer a healer. They had to become the community's protector, and in doing so, its executioner. This was not an act of vengeance, but a profound and sorrowful duty. It was a final, terrible act of mercy, performed to protect the community from the monster and, in some traditions, to release the tormented human soul trapped inside its monstrous shell. The execution was a solemn ritual. Often, a small group of trusted community members, their faces grim in the torchlight, would be led by the shaman to confront the Wendigo. The death had to be absolute. The creature was killed, and its body was then systematically dismembered to prevent its reanimation. The icy heart, the physical seat of the curse, was cut from the chest. It was then either shattered into pieces or, more commonly, burned in the roaring flames of a great fire until nothing remained. The rest of the body was often burned as well, the smoke and ashes scattered to the four winds, ensuring that the malevolent spirit could never rise again. It was a grim, necessary surgery on the body of the community, cutting out a diseased part to ensure the survival of the whole. For centuries, this delicate and dangerous balance was maintained by the spiritual guardians of the people, a system of belief and action perfectly adapted to the harsh realities of their world. But into this ancient world, a new story was about to arrive, carried across an ocean on the winds of empire and faith. They came in the 17th century, men of a different god, clad in long black robes that seemed to drink the very light from the forest. They were the Jesuits, the fiercely intelligent and zealous missionaries from France who plunged into the Canadian wilderness with a singular purpose: to conquer this new world not for gold, but for the soul of Christ. They left behind a world of stone cathedrals and ordered theology, and found themselves in a vast, green chaos, a spiritual landscape they could not comprehend. These men were scholars and explorers, trained to observe and document. Their detailed annual reports, known as the Jesuit Relations, provide some of the earliest written accounts of the Algonquian peoples. They were fascinated by the cultures they encountered, but viewed them through a rigid, unyielding filter of their own 17th century European Christian worldview. To them, the complex spiritual landscape of the boreal forest was a dark, pagan wilderness, populated by demons and governed by superstition. And when they first heard the stories of the Wendigo, they were both horrified and grimly fascinated. In 1636, the missionary Paul Lejeune wrote of the local Montagnais Naskapi people's fear of a creature he called an Atchin. He described it as a man-eater that would prey upon isolated individuals. A few decades later, another report detailed a disturbing incident. A group of men, mad with hunger, had been seized by a strange affliction that made them act like ravenous beasts, devouring women and children. The Jesuits were witnessing the effects of the Wendigo belief, the social terror, and the results of starvation-induced psychosis. But they lacked the cultural framework to understand its cause. They saw not a spiritual sickness born of specific cultural taboos, but something more familiar to their own world. They saw the devil. Reaching for the closest analog in their own folklore, the Jesuits repeatedly compared the Wendigo to the European werewolf. To them, a man transforming into a ravenous, flesh-eating monster was the clear mark of a demonic pact, a surrender of the soul to satanic power. This was a profound and consequential misinterpretation. In the Algonquian worldview, the person who became a Wendigo was a tragic victim, a soul who had lost a desperate spiritual battle. In the Jesuit interpretation, they became a willing villain, a heretic, a monster who had chosen evil. The narrative was subtly but critically shifted from one of tragedy to one of pure demonic malevolence. Where the shaman saw a patient to be healed, the Jesuit saw a sinner to be condemned. The Jesuits took the threat seriously, but their proposed cure was not a fatty broth, it was baptism and exorcism. Where the shaman offered warm grease to fight a cold spirit, the Jesuit offered cold water to fight a hot hell. They documented the stories not as a way to understand a different culture's laws, but as proof of the demonic forces at play in this unconverted land, further justifying their mission to bring the light of Christ into the darkness. In their reports, they recorded what they saw and heard, and in doing so, they provided an invaluable, if biased, historical record of the Wendigo belief at the moment of contact. But they also began a long process of transformation. The power of the shaman was in the spoken word, the ritual, the shared breath of the community. The power of the Jesuit was in the pen. By writing it down, by filtering it through their own fears and theology, they took the first step in lifting the Wendigo out of its original context. They were the first outsiders to attempt to capture its shadow in ink, and in doing so, they began to change its shape forever, setting it on a long and twisted path that would eventually lead it out of the northern forests and into the nightmares of the entire world. For centuries, the Wendigo lived in the realm of the story, a chilling whisper around a winter fire, a spiritual warning given form. It was a potent and terrifying possibility, a belief that governed the moral and social order of the northern forests. But in the late 19th century, as the Dominion of Canada sought to extend its rigid, black and white rule over the vast and ancient territories of the West, the line between myth and reality would be irrevocably blurred. The story of the Wendigo was about to be written in the official ink of colonial law, and its new, horrifying text would be the life and death of a man named Swift Runner. Before the winter of 1878, Swift Runner was a man of considerable standing. A Plains Cree trapper, he was known for his skill as a hunter and his deep knowledge of the vast, unforgiving wilderness west of Hudson Bay. At nearly 6.5 feet tall, he was a physically imposing figure, a man who carried himself with confidence. He was not an outcast, living on the fringes of society. He was a husband and the father of 6 children, a family man who provided for his kin. Crucially, he was also a man who walked between 2 worlds. He had served as a trusted guide for the newly formed Northwest Mounted Police, the red-coated agents of the Canadian government, leading them through the labyrinthine forests and muskeg that were his home. He knew the ancient paths of his people, and he knew the rigid ways of the newcomers. This familiarity, this trust he had built with the very forces of colonial order, would make his eventual fall all the more shocking and profound. The winter of 1878 arrived with a particular vengeance. The cold was a physical blow, and the snows came early and stayed late, a crushing siege that isolated communities and made hunting nearly impossible. Starvation, the constant, seasonal threat, became a grim and widespread reality. In the autumn, Swift Runner had taken his family, his wife, his 6 children, his mother-in-law, and his brother, to their winter trapping grounds, a remote area deep in the forests of what is now central Alberta. It was a journey into the heart of the wilderness from which they would never, as a family, return. Months later, in the spring of 1879, Swift Runner emerged from the forest alone. He made his way to the Catholic mission near the town of St. Albert, a ragged, haunted figure. He was gaunt, but not, observers noted, to the point of starvation. To the priests and settlers, he told a story of profound tragedy. The winter had been cruel, he said. Game had vanished. One by one, his entire family had succumbed to the relentless grip of famine and sickness. He was the sole survivor of a terrible, but not entirely uncommon, wilderness ordeal. At first, his story was accepted as a grim testament to the harshness of life in the north. But doubt began to fester, not among the white settlers, but among his own people. Other Cree who had been in the region began to whisper. His mother-in-law, who had chosen not to winter with the family at the last minute, was the first to voice a darker suspicion. She knew the resilience of her daughter and grandchildren. She knew the skills of Swift Runner. The story of simple starvation did not ring true. More damning were the nightmares that began to plague Swift Runner himself. He was tormented by visions, and in his agitated state, he spoke of being haunted by evil spirits. He told the priests that a Wendigo had possessed him, a confession that, to the European mind, sounded like a pagan delusion, a symptom of grief-induced madness. But to the Cree who heard it, it was a horrifying admission of an unthinkable truth. The whispers grew louder. This was not a story of starvation. This was a story of the Wendigo. The rumors eventually reached the ears of the Northwest Mounted Police at Fort Saskatchewan. The very men Swift Runner had once guided now looked upon him with suspicion. His conflicting stories, his haunted demeanor, and the serious, fearful accusations from his own community were enough to warrant an investigation. An expedition was mounted. A small party of policemen, guided by Cree trackers, set out with Swift Runner himself to lead them back to the site of his winter camp, the place where he claimed his family had found their graves. The journey back into the forest was a grim, silent affair. As they drew closer to the camp, Swift Runner's agitation grew, his composure cracking under the strain of returning to the scene of his secrets. When they finally arrived, the spring thaw had begun to peel back the shroud of snow, revealing a scene of grotesque and absolute horror. The camp was not a place of peaceful rest. It was a slaughterhouse. Human bones, picked clean of all flesh, were scattered about the clearing. A small child's moccasin lay half buried in the mud. In a cooking pot near the fire pit, investigators found a mass of human fat. The skull of his wife was found nearby, its cranium smashed open. Of his children, only fragments remained. The evidence was undeniable and sickeningly clear. This was not a case of a family starving to death. This was a case of a family being systematically butchered and consumed. Swift Runner's story had been a lie, and the worst fears of his Cree relatives were confirmed in the most brutal way imaginable. The Wendigo had been here. Under arrest and confronted with the irrefutable evidence, Swift Runner's will finally broke. He gave a full confession, a chilling narrative that plunged his interrogators into the heart of a worldview they could not comprehend. He told them that as the winter wore on and the hunger grew more desperate, he began to have dreams. In these dreams, a malicious spirit came to him. It whispered to him, tempted him, promising him survival if he would only eat the flesh of his family. He claimed he fought against it, but the spirit was too strong. It entered him, possessed him, and drove him to the acts of horrific violence that had annihilated his family. He killed his wife first, then his brother, then his mother-in-law. Then, one by one, he butchered and ate his own children. His confession was not a simple admission of guilt. It was a spiritual testimony. In his mind, he was not a murderer in the way the white man's law understood it. He was a man who had lost a terrible battle with a supernatural entity. He had been transformed, against his will, into a monster. He had, in the parlance of his people, gone Wendigo. To his Cree interrogators, this explanation made a terrifying kind of sense. It was a recognized spiritual crisis, the worst possible fate that could befall a person. But to the officers of the Northwest Mounted Police, his words were something else entirely. They were either the ravings of a madman or the convenient, superstitious excuse of a calculating and uniquely brutal killer. Their job was to translate his spiritual horror story into the cold, hard language of their criminal code, willful and malicious murder. The trial of Swift Runner, held at Fort Saskatchewan in the summer of 1879, was a landmark event. It was more than the prosecution of a single man. It was a powerful piece of political theatre, a stark demonstration of the Canadian government's authority. The Crown was here to prove that its law, the Queen's law, was now the only law that mattered in these territories, superseding all traditional Indigenous customs and spiritual beliefs. The court listened in stunned silence as the details of the case were laid out. Swift Runner did not deny the acts. He sat quietly, a man resigned to his fate, seemingly indifferent to the proceedings. From his perspective, his life was already over. He was a damned soul, a vessel for a monster. The judgment of this foreign court was a mere formality. The verdict was swift and certain: guilty. The sentence, mandatory for murder, was death by hanging. The authorities ordered the construction of a gallows at the fort, a stark wooden symbol of a new and unforgiving justice. On the morning of his execution, in a final, poignant act of assimilation, Swift Runner was baptized by a Catholic priest, abandoning the spiritual world that had defined his life and his crime, perhaps in a desperate, last-minute search for a different kind of salvation. He was led to the gallows, and before a crowd of witnesses, both white and Indigenous, he was executed. The official report stated that justice had been served. The monster of the North had been punished. But the death of Swift Runner did not end the story. It was the beginning of a new and powerful chapter in the legend of the Wendigo. His case became a sensation. His story repeated in hushed tones around campfires and reported with lurid, sensational detail in the newspapers of the East. For the Cree and other Indigenous communities, the tale was a horrifying, real-world confirmation of their ancient beliefs. It was proof that the Wendigo was not just a story, but a tangible threat, a spiritual cancer that could erupt into the physical world with devastating consequences. For the growing population of white settlers, traders, and authorities, the case had a different, but equally powerful, impact. It cemented the Wendigo in the colonial imagination, but stripped it of its spiritual nuance. Swift Runner became the Wendigo. His gruesome, documented acts became the definitive portrait of the creature. The story moved from the realm of folklore into the realm of true crime. No longer just a spirit, the Wendigo was now a historical figure, a cannibal of the North, a specific and uniquely Canadian bogeyman. This case became the primary historical proof of the Wendigo's existence for the outside world, a grim and foundational text that would be cited by anthropologists and sensationalized by writers for generations to come. The tragic story of Swift Runner, a man caught between the desperation of the old world and the rigid laws of the new, was now forever fused with the image of the monster he claimed had consumed him. The case of Swift Runner carved the Wendigo into the official record of the Canadian West. It was no longer merely a superstition to be dismissed. It was now a legal precedent, a motive for murder that had been entered into evidence. For the Cree, the trial was a tragic affirmation of an ancient truth. But for the rational, scientific mind of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it presented a disturbing puzzle. The spiritual explanation was insufficient. The colonial world needed a different kind of answer, one that could be categorized, studied, and explained not by a shaman's story, but by a doctor's diagnosis. And so, from the collision of these two worlds, a new and controversial concept was born: Wendigo psychosis. The term was coined by early anthropologists and psychologists attempting to fit the horrifying accounts into a Western medical framework. They classified it as a culture-bound syndrome, a mental disorder whose specific symptoms and expression were shaped by the cultural beliefs of a particular group. In essence, they argued that while the terror of starvation was universal, the form the resulting madness took was uniquely Algonquian. The legend of the Wendigo, they proposed, provided a pre-written script for the mind to follow when it finally broke under the unbearable pressure of famine and isolation. Early researchers meticulously outlined the supposed progression of the illness. It was said to begin with a period of profound melancholy and withdrawal. The afflicted person would lose all appetite for normal food, a cruel and deeply ironic first symptom. They would grow sullen and morose, often complaining of nausea and experiencing a deep, unshakable anxiety. This initial phase would then give way to a terrifying obsession. The individual would begin to see the people around them not as kin, but as a source of sustenance. They would confess to having an overwhelming, horrifying craving for human flesh. In their mind, a terrible transformation was already underway. They believed they were slowly turning into a Wendigo, their humanity being consumed from the inside by that cold, hungry spirit. The final stage was the explosive act of cannibalistic murder. This, the theorists argued, was the point of no return, the moment the delusion fully consumed reality. The person was no longer themselves, they were the monster of the myth. This clinical narrative offered a neat, if chilling, explanation. It took the supernatural horror of the Wendigo and repackaged it as a tragic but understandable psychological breakdown. The spirit on the wind had been captured, labeled, and filed away in the annals of medical curiosity. For decades, Wendigo psychosis was accepted in many academic circles as a genuine, if rare, condition. It was a perfect, self-contained example of how culture could shape the very nature of madness. But as the 20th century progressed, a new generation of scholars began to question the diagnosis itself. They looked back at the original source material, the same Jesuit reports, traders' journals, and early anthropological notes, and found the evidence for a distinct, widespread syndrome to be surprisingly thin. Many of the accounts were second-hand, sensationalized tales told years after the fact. The most lurid details, they argued, were often amplified by outsiders who were predisposed to see the indigenous world as a place of savage and exotic horrors. These revisionist scholars proposed a different interpretation. The Wendigo, they argued, was not primarily a mental illness. It was a complex moral and social metaphor. When an indigenous person spoke of someone going Wendigo, they were often not making a clinical diagnosis. They were making a moral judgment. The term was a powerful condemnation of anyone who exhibited the core traits of the monster: extreme greed, selfishness, and a refusal to participate in the communal responsibilities of survival. The lazy hunter who let his family go hungry, the hoarder who hid food while others starved. These were the people labeled with the spirit of the Wendigo. It was a tool of social control, a way of naming and shaming behavior that threatened the entire community's existence. The truth, as it so often does, likely lies in the murky space between these two interpretations. There is no doubt that people in the unforgiving North sometimes faced the horrifying choice of starvation or survival cannibalism. And there is no doubt that extreme, prolonged starvation can induce a state of psychosis. The Wendigo legend provided the essential cultural framework through which these unthinkable events could be understood, processed, and, most importantly, condemned. Whether it was a real syndrome or a powerful metaphor ultimately misses the point. For the people who lived under its shadow, the threat was real. The Wendigo was the name they gave to the absolute worst that could happen, not just to the body, but to the soul. Wendigo psychosis remains a fascinating chapter in the story, a flawed but revealing attempt by the modern world to put a clinical label on a deep spiritual horror it could never truly comprehend. While scientists and doctors were attempting to confine the Wendigo to the dry pages of medical journals, a different kind of transformation was taking place. The creature was escaping the academic world and stalking into a new and hungry wilderness, the popular imagination. The same Jesuit reports and sensationalized traders' accounts that had fueled the theory of a psychosis now served as the raw, bloody material for a new breed of storyteller. The Wendigo was about to be lifted entirely out of its cultural context and reborn as a monster of modern horror fiction. The pivotal moment in this transition came in 1910. An English author named Algernon Blackwood, a master of the subtle and atmospheric tale of supernatural dread, published a novella simply titled The Wendigo. Blackwood had likely learned of the creature from the wealth of adventure stories and ethnographies that were popular in the Edwardian era. He took the name and the core concept, a malevolent spirit of the northern Canadian wilderness, and used them to create a masterpiece of psychological terror. Blackwood's genius was in what he chose to leave out. His story is not about cannibalism. It contains no descriptions of a gaunt, skeletal monster. Instead, his Wendigo is an almost entirely unseen presence, a terrifying force of nature. It is the spirit of the lonely places, a being of immense sadness and horror that is carried on the wind. In his tale, the creature does not eat its victims, it abducts them. It snatches a hunter from his campfire and forces him to run with it at an impossible, supernatural speed through the treetops. His feet burned and mangled from the friction. The victim is eventually found, alive but driven completely mad, reeking of a strange, otherworldly stench and able to utter only a single, terrified word: Wendigo. Blackwood's story was a sensation, and its influence cannot be overstated. It was this piece of fiction, not authentic folklore, that introduced the Wendigo to the English-speaking world. The spelling he used, Wendigo with an E, became the standard for nearly all subsequent horror literature. More importantly, he fundamentally shifted the creature's nature. The Algonquian Wendigo was a human being who had become a monster through a specific moral failing. Blackwood's Wendigo was a pre-existing elemental, a non-human spirit that personified the terrifying, soul-crushing vastness of the wilderness itself. It was no longer a story about the evil within man, but about an external evil that could seize him. This new literary Wendigo was an irresistible creation. The celebrated American author of cosmic horror, H.P. Lovecraft, was an admirer of Blackwood's work and encouraged his contemporary, August Derleth, to incorporate the creature into his burgeoning Cthulhu mythos. Derleth did just that, reimagining the Wendigo as a great old one named Ithaqua, the Windwalker. Ithaqua was a colossal, vaguely humanoid entity who stalked the subarctic, snatching up unsuspecting travelers and bringing them to his alien home on a distant star. With this, the transformation was nearly complete. The Wendigo had been fully severed from its human, tragic origins. It was no longer a fallen person, it was now a space god. From the high art of weird fiction, the Wendigo descended into the lurid, colorful pages of pulp magazines and horror anthologies. It became a stock monster, a reliable North American bogeyman that could be slotted into any story that needed a dose of wilderness terror. The tragic figure of the starving man with a heart of ice and the complex social taboo he represented were almost entirely forgotten. They were replaced by a thrilling but hollow phantom of the woods. The profound cautionary tale of the Cree and Ojibwe had become a simple creature feature, a monster to be vanquished by a rugged hero before the final page. The spirit had been captured, tamed, and turned into entertainment. As the Wendigo moved from the written page to the visual mediums of the 20th and 21st centuries, it faced a new problem. Algernon Blackwood's monster was terrifying precisely because it was unseen. But film, television, and video games cannot easily trade in the unseen. A monster needs a face. The original folkloric descriptions of a gaunt, emaciated human were certainly horrifying, but to a modern audience saturated with images of zombies and ghouls, it perhaps lacked a unique visual identity. Pop culture demanded an icon, a recognizable silhouette. And so, the Wendigo was given a new face, one that was visually striking, deeply symbolic, and almost entirely inauthentic, the skull of a deer, crowned with a rack of formidable antlers. This now ubiquitous image has no basis in traditional Algonquian lore. In the original stories, the only animal consistently associated with the Wendigo was the owl, a nocturnal hunter and a harbinger of death. The deer, a symbol of grace and a primary source of life-giving sustenance, had no connection to the creature. The origin of the antlered look can be traced to a much more recent source, the 2001 independent horror film Wendigo, by director Larry Fessenden. He later admitted that he did not research the myth deeply before filming, combining a ghost story he had heard as a child with his own artistic license. While the creature in his film is portrayed abstractly, the promotional art and the film's general aesthetic introduce the idea of the Wendigo as a vengeful, stag-like spirit of the forest. This image, combined with the eerie, skeletal illustrations in the popular children's horror book series, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, struck a powerful chord. The stag and the antlered skull are potent, pre-existing archetypes, especially in European folklore. They evoke the Celtic Cernunnos, the wild hunt, and a general sense of a powerful, ancient, and dangerous forest god. It was an effective and immediate visual shorthand for primordial wilderness spirit, and it was quickly adopted as the Wendigo's definitive modern look. Once established, the antlered Wendigo exploded across pop culture. The television show Supernatural featured a memorable version, a gaunt humanoid with a deer skull for a head that could be killed with a flare gun. It was a classic monster of the week, its deep moral and spiritual context stripped away in favor of a thrilling hunt. Marvel Comics had introduced its own version much earlier, in 1973. The Marvel Wendigo was a massive, white-furred, yeti-like brute who frequently battled the Hulk and Wolverine. Interestingly, Marvel kept the core rule. The curse is triggered by an act of cannibalism in the Canadian wilderness, but altered its appearance completely to fit the sensibilities of a superhero comic. The 2015 video game Until Dawn brought the creature to a new generation. The game was a massive success and did a remarkable job of recentering the cannibalism origin story. Its Wendigos were depicted as screeching, feral, and terrifyingly fast humanoids, closer to the lore in spirit, though not necessarily in their final visual design. More recently, the 2021 film Antlers, produced by Guillermo del Toro, attempted to respectfully engage with the legend. The film employed a Native American consultant, explicitly mentioned its Algonquian origins, and powerfully tied the Wendigo to modern metaphorical themes of abuse, environmental destruction, and corporate greed, a consumption of the earth. And yet, when the creature was finally revealed, it was the now standard, spectacular, antlered beast. The image had become so embedded in the cultural consciousness that even a film trying to be authentic felt compelled to use it. The Wendigo of modern pop culture is now a hybrid, a syncretic monster. It often has the name and sometimes the cannibalism origin of the Algonquian legend, but it wears the face of a European forest deity. It is a visually stunning and undeniably cool creation, a perfect monster for the digital age. But in this final transformation, something has been lost. The profound, intimate, and deeply human horror of the original story. The tragedy of a neighbor, a friend, a family member with a gaunt frame and a heart of solid ice, has been largely replaced by an external, non-human beast. The cautionary tale has become a creature feature, its ancient warning now muffled by the roar of a spectacular, but ultimately unfamiliar, monster. By journeying through the long, dark story of the Wendigo, we have glimpsed more than just a fearsome monster of legend. We have seen a chilling reflection of our own world, of human struggles, and of timeless values. The Wendigo emerges from the frigid winters of the Algonquian North, carrying an urgent, bone-chilling message. There are lines that must not be crossed, lest we lose the very thing that makes us human. In the snowbound forests centuries ago, this message was a matter of literal survival. Share what little you have. Support the weakest among you. Do not let desperation turn you against your own. Through the haunting figure of the Wendigo, the elders taught these lessons with a clarity that could freeze the blood. We have seen how the Wendigo's origins lie in the stark realities of a world where winter can kill, a context that gave birth to a spirit embodying hunger and cold. Its physical form, as imagined by different tribes, is a grotesque tapestry of deathly features. The gaunt ribs and sallow skin of starvation, the bloody mouth of an unforgivable sin, and the icy heart of a soul turned utterly cold. These descriptions were not merely to horrify, they were laden with symbolism. Each detail is a moral metaphor. The Wendigo's perpetual emaciation reminds us that greed only breeds more hunger, never satisfaction. Its heart of ice warns that to forsake love and kinship is to become frozen in spirit. Historically, the Wendigo left real scars. The accounts of its encounters and possessions show the tangible impact of belief. In the grisly case of Swift Runner, we saw how a community, grappling with an unimaginable crime, interpreted it through the Wendigo myth, a framework that, to them, made sense of the senseless. We have seen how this ancient story collided with the rigid, uncomprehending forces of the outside world, transformed by Jesuit missionaries into a demon, dissected by scientists as a psychosis, and sensationalized by writers as a phantom of the woods. And yet, even in its new skins, be it a stag-headed forest god in a Hollywood film or a Marvel monster brawling with the Hulk, one can often still find a kernel of the original truth. The Wendigo is hunger that ends in horror, a caution that strikes a deep and primal chord. In a world where we still confront crises, be they pandemics, famine, or societal breakdown, the Wendigo's warning echoes with a terrifying new relevance. The hunger it represents is no longer just for food. It is the insatiable hunger for power, for wealth, for resources. Modern indigenous writers have powerfully reclaimed the Wendigo as a metaphor for the consuming sickness of colonialism and industrial capitalism, a culture that, like the monster, eats everything and is never full. In this light, the Wendigo is not a relic of a distant past. It walks among us now, its heart of ice beating in the endless drive for growth at any cost, its gaunt shadow falling over our ravaged landscapes and fractured communities. In the end, the Wendigo compels us to ask a question that remains terribly relevant, whether we are faced with physical starvation or the figurative hunger for more. What would we do to survive? At what point do we stop being who we thought we were, if we compromise our ethics? The chill of the Wendigo is not the fear that a literal monster might be lurking in the woods. It is the chill of understanding how fragile the line is between us and it. Its breath is the blizzard wind. Its footprints, when we find them, lead back not only into the dark forest, but into the darkest corners of the human experience. Remember the Wendigo, and choose the warmth of community and conscience over the icy path of selfishness. Thank you for coming with us on this journey into the dark heart of the Wendigo legend. Our mission is to continue exploring these complex and often overlooked stories from our past, delving into the myths, legends, and folklore that reveal the deepest truths about our shared human experience. If you wish to be a part of this ongoing exploration and not miss our next documentary, we would be honored if you would subscribe to the channel. As always, thank you for your time and attention.